Afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the last day of the workshops. I hope everyone enjoys the previous days sessions and also the self-study modules that we give to you. Um, Today we have again our guest speakers from OECD, Janos, which you meet yesterday, and today we also have Olivian from OECD as well. So they will take you through the in-depth analysis of the STRI, which you have seen in the video and the exercise. And then with me here, I have Johan and Natnisha, who've been researchers of ESCAP and take also involvement in the ESCAP OECD research projects, regulatory analysis on digital trade that has been happened over 12 months or so. So they will help me go through the exercise and concepts of ESCAP, Regional Digital Trade Integration Index, which we construct to complement the research on digital trade regulations, which you can use in complement with other tools such as the STRI and also with other ESCAP tools on this domain. So I think I would let OECD to present first because it would be more connections to what you have already introduced during the yesterday sessions with the OECD teams. So please, Janos and Oliver, happy to have you here. Please take the floor.
Thank you very much, Witada. We're really happy to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this workshop. So Janos presented yesterday the digital STRI and the STRI as evidence-based tools that we use to analyze restrictions to services trade, and in particular to services trade enabled digitally. So I am going to share my screen on the exercise we had proposed for today. Could you please confirm you're seeing my screen?
Yes, it's good.
Yes? Okay. Thank you, Janos. So for today's session, we had proposed a video that hopefully everyone has had time to have a look at it. So in the video, we presented the framework and we presented also this exercise. So today we're just going to discuss it and go through it with you. So for the context and just as a small reminder of the video, we had proposed two exercises. The first one is on how to find information on digital trade. And the second one is on the use of the simulator. So here we're going to start with the first one. So here the idea was for you to select one country and then to go answering each of these questions. So would any of you want to present how he or she has approached this exercise? Any of the participants, if you want to start, if not, I'll do as we would have done. But it would be great if any of you would like to kick off the session. No? Okay, no problem. So we're going to select an economy. And for example, we could select Cambodia as an example. So we're going to answer all of these questions regarding Cambodia. So first of all, I'm going to open the simulator. Can you see the simulator? Yes, great. So we're very happy also to present the new simulator, because as you saw in the video, it was a previous version of this digital STRI simulator, and we just updated it yesterday evening. So we have the brand new simulator regarding a new structure of presenting it, but the content and information is exactly the same as you already saw in the video and as maybe you tried before this session. So here we're going to choose Asia Pacific. So as we were saying, we're going to choose Cambodia as a target country just for this exercise. So as you see here, Cambodia is not a worst performing country, but it really has a high score. And so we're going to compare the score to other best performing countries, as could be Australia or Japan. So first of all, the first question is, what is the current level of restrictiveness in this economy? So as you see, Cambodia is here. So we can select it. So the current level of restrictiveness in Cambodia, as described by the DSTRI index, is 0.4 of restrictiveness. This means, as we were saying before, that 1 is a full level of restrictiveness, while 0 is a fully open economy. So here we see there are important restrictions, but it is, of course, not fully closed. So that is for the level of restriction. Then the second question was, what are the key policy areas that drive this result? So the policy areas, you see them here in the different colors that are then explained and that are then justified in the specific policy areas. So for Cambodia, as we see, the key policy areas that drive the result are infrastructure and other barriers affecting trade in digitally enabled services. So the next question is, what are some of the key measures and regulations that contribute to the score? So that we will see that while we access each of these policy areas and we see the detail and the legal justification of the score. So here, as we see for infrastructure, there's 6 measures, 6 points that are scored as restrictive. And here, for other barriers, we have 4. So some of the key measures that drive the result we see here are mostly on interconnection and the infrastructure of the telecommunications sector. Meaning here where what explains this measure is that here we're answering yes to the mandate to interconnect. However, as we see afterwards on the dominant firms and dominant providers, we see that there is no specific decision from the usually competition or telecommunications authority that they designate a specific dominant provider. So this means that in this type of regulatory environment where there is usually one of the main providers of the infrastructure, it can be a dominant provider and so a dominant player. And when there is a dominant player, there has to be a regulation that obliges to interconnect and that puts specific obligations on this dominant provider in telecommunications. However, as there is none, when we have a regulation mandating interconnection, while there is no way of imposing it in the sense that there is no decision that has determined one of the players that is dominant, we consider it a restriction. So this is one of the main measures that moves the result in infrastructure for Cambodia. And the others are in other barriers affecting trade in digitally enabled services. We see that the Cambodian legislation requires a performance requirement, meaning that there is an obligation to source inputs locally. There are also limitations on downloading and streaming. There's also a requirement to have a commercial and local presence in the country. So all of these are measures that, regarding the benchmark, are considered restrictive. Lastly, the last question in this first exercise on how does your economy compare to main trade partners globally and regionally, that is one of the changes that we have introduced to the digital STRI. So now we're able to present. Sorry? We're able to present a presentation of the full view of the Asia Pacific region. So regarding the question on how the performance of Cambodia compares to other countries, we see the situation here of Cambodia, where other countries like Kazakhstan, China, Laos have more restrictive environments. However, there's wide possibilities still of improvement of the result, as there are many other best performing countries in the region. Do any of you have any question for now? Yes? Sorry, I don't see the full name. Irene Cruz?
Yeah.
Yes, hi.
Yeah. Hi. Hello. What's the difference between having a local presence and a commercial presence? Those are two different, how to say this, indicators. But yeah, sorry, I'm not familiar.
No worries. Thank you. It's a very good question. So we considered we have two measures that score this requirement. So one is commercial presence, as you were indicating, and the other is local presence. Commercial presence is when there is a requirement to install a branch, or there is or install an agency. So there is a need to create a physical structure in the country. While local presence is more the designation of a representative, or to have, for example, an address in the country without really having to establish a branch or an agency. This means that we're scoring it as much more restrictive and much heavier for companies to have a commercial presence in the country than a local presence. Does
Okay, so what is more restrictive is commercial presence.
Yes.
And less restrictive is local presence. The representative.
Yes,
right.
exactly.
Yeah, okay.
So we both consider them. They are both restrictions. However, they don't have the same heaviness for a company.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the clarification.
Yeah. Thank you. So one could, as just a small follow-up for the local presence, it could be just to designate a lawyer as a representative, or someone to have an address in the country, but not really the full structure of a company or a branch. Great. So thank you very much. Any of you has any other questions? So this is an interactive session, and it is really the opportunity to also ask any questions that maybe weren't clear yesterday, as it is really a follow-up of the same subject that Janos and Javier presented yesterday. No question? Okay. Yes, Irene?
Sorry, I have another one. Well, actually, maybe
yes,
it's maybe for later, for the second part of the exercise. There was and maybe you will cover this anyway. There was a part that says that it has to benchmark, but I wasn't able to do that. I was looking for like a setting for a benchmark, but maybe you could cover that when you make this presentation. How to, I picked Indonesia, and then when I got into the part, how does the Indonesia perform against like the best practice benchmark? I cannot find what's the best practice benchmark.
Yes, it is a great question, and yeah, we will cover it just now, but thank you very much for putting it forward and for your participation. So I'm going to go to the second exercise. So this second exercise, you can still see my screen, don't you? Yes. Okay, so this second exercise is on how to use the function in the tool that proposes the possibility to do a simulation of policy reforms. That's why it is called the simulator. So here it also asks you to select a target economy and then to go answering to each of these three questions. The first one is, how does your economy's STRI result compare to the best practice? Then we're going to see what are the regulatory gaps. And in the end, what combination of measures would provide the most reduction in the STRI value? And we will also cover your very good question, Irwin, on the benchmark. So I'm going to go again to the simulator. And here we're going to select Cambodia, or maybe if you want Indonesia, as you had already done it for Indonesia. So how does the economy's STRI result compare to the best practice? So here, Indonesia, you can find here the full result. So Indonesia has a 0.3 score in the index. As we were seeing before, Cambodia had a 0.4. So this means that Indonesia presents a regulatory environment that it is more open than that of Cambodia, for example, regarding the trade in digitally enabled services. So how does the economy compare to others? So as we were saying before, the best practice in the region were Japan and Australia. So here we're going to compare Indonesia, that it is now our new target economy. We're going to compare it to Australia. So you see here the score of Australia, that it is much lower, so it reflects a much opener environment, to Australia and to Japan. So as you see in the simulator, here you can see the main economy that we're still having the database for Indonesia here, and we're comparing it to Japan, Australia, and let's also put Cambodia as we had been looking at it just before. Okay, so we have here the three economies to which we are comparing our target economy, that is Indonesia. So what do we actually see here? We see that for Indonesia, the key policy areas that contribute to the result are infrastructure, electronic transactions, and other barriers affecting trade in digitally enabled services. As we were seeing before for Cambodia, Cambodia's score it's higher because it also has a big importance of the payment restrictions on payment systems. And for example, the restrictions on infrastructure are also higher than those that we find in Indonesia. But here we're trying to compare to best practice, and so to best performers. So here, as we compare it to Japan and Australia, we see that the restrictions on infrastructure are much lower, that none of these best performing countries have the restrictions on payment systems, and also that the restrictions in the policy area called other barriers affecting trade in digitally enabled services, that as you had rightly asked before, it includes local presence, commercial presence, performance requirements, etc. So these are much lower than what we find in our target economy, that is Indonesia. So what are the best practices, as you were asking before? So the best practice is what has been considered when constructing the STRI as no restriction. So the STRI doesn't consider that any type of legislation is a barrier. So we're not at all in the logic of saying if something is regulated, we consider it is a restriction to trade. No, we're trying, when constructing the database, we consider what has been the agreed best practices in certain specific sectors, or here regarding digitally enabled services. So for example, as we were seeing before in infrastructure, the best practice is to have an asymmetric legislation where the mandatory requirements of interconnection, of having some specific accounting structure, are imposed only on those dominant providers. So if there is a dominant provider and there is no legislation obliging it to interconnect, we consider that a restriction. As on the same time, we consider as a restriction the fact of having an obligation to interconnect, but on the same time, there's no specific player that is dominant in the sector. So that is why the benchmark, you don't really see it explained here, but it is just behind the construction of the database. So that was for your question. So then, how does your economy's STRI result compare to the best practice? We were seeing here how we compare, and this is the mechanism and the tool we use to compare the economies. Then what are some of the regulatory gaps? We were saying that the main gaps here for Indonesia are in infrastructure, that they have a score of 4. Here, the score of 4 responds mainly to specific restrictions on cross-border data flows. So we see that the restrictions are here, while before in Cambodia, we were seeing that they were more in the infrastructure, in the interconnection practices. Then the other main point of gap that we see is on electronic transactions and other barriers. So in electronic transaction, you see that the 3 points that increase the score are the inexistence of an online tax registration and declaration possibility for non-resident foreign providers, and the fact that the national contract rule deviates from international standards. Lastly, other gaps that we identify are here on the requirement to have a commercial presence and a local presence. So that was for the second question. And for the last question, what combination of measures would provide the most reduction in the STRI values? Here we come again to the simulator. So the idea is to propose specific policy reforms that would decrease the value in the STRI. So for example, this can be seen by changing the score. So providing a simulation of a changing policy in these specific areas. So for example, currently there is this commercial presence requirement where all exporters and importers are subject to a specific permit. And to get this permit, it is necessary to have an establishment in the country. That is the commercial presence we are scoring here. And if there is a change, then we change it in the simulator and the score changes. So we actually see what would be the impact of this policy reform in the overall score. So here you can also see what is the score once it has been edited. So we see that it has reduced, and the same happens with the local presence requirement. Here, if there is a policy reform where this changes, the score also gets a bit lower, and the same happens here for the cross-border transfer of personal data. So for example, some very heavy requirements for international business is to have the local storage requirements. Here we see that Indonesia has in place a data localization requirement. So if this requirement is suppressed, the score goes down again. And this is how you see the exact impact of those reforms, at least on the score of the STRI. Do any of you have any question on this? And Irwin, did I answer your question on the benchmark?
Just to confirm about the benchmark, the best practice. So the best performers in the region are quite clear, because you can go to the look at the ones with the best scores. But for best practice, are you it means that the score is 0. Am I correct?
Yes.
Okay.
That is correct.
So basically, like if for infrastructure, if Indonesia is 0 over there, like for example, yeah, then it's basically a best practice, at least for that part of the score, right? Because there's some I think where was it? Let's think like Japan or Canada. Oh no, Japan or Australia. They don't have a score for payments, which means it's assumed that they have best practice for payments. So it's not restrictive. Their legislation is not restrictive.
Yes, so their legislation is not restrictive on the specific measures that we're scoring in the index.
Okay.
So it is a very good question. So for example, for Japan, for payment system, we see it's 0. So why it is 0? Because the questions that we're asking is whether there is any discrimination in the access to payment settlement methods. The second one is if national payment security standards deviate from international standards. And the third one, if there is any restriction on internet banking or insurance. So here we consider that the best practice is to have a no to each answer, because it is a best practice not to discriminate foreign providers when accessing settlement measures, and it is a best practice to have international standards regarding security of payment systems. So this is why the best practice is constructed within the index. So we're already looking at that best practice, and all countries, when we construct the index, they are compared to that specific best practice.
Thank you. Thank you for explaining.
Great, thank you. Does anyone else have a question? I don't see any other hands up. So Witada, if you want, I can pass back the floor to you. And if someone else has any question afterwards, we can. Janos, yeah.
Thank you. Maybe we can give it back to Erwin for a final question. Then I just have one thing to say about it.
Okay. Sorry. Again, it's me. This is not related with the index itself, but something that was mentioned in the video. It said that you're gonna have like 22 more countries being integrated in this index simulator next year. Will that include the Philippines and Singapore? And also, second question, which is probably related to the next module. How is this index related to the regional the Rdtii? Well, basically the self the exercise before this. So yeah, there.
Okay, so I'm going to reply to your first question, and as Janos, you were already going to add something, you can reply also to the second one. So for your question, we're adding these new countries, but the simulator you're now seeing in the screen already has them, because we had updated it yesterday evening, so we're already including these new countries. So the only 2 new countries that will come next year are Singapore and Vietnam, because they are part of another process of updating it. So for those 2 countries, you have both the index. So you have the digital STRI and the full STRI. That, as you know, it covers many more sectors, so it covers 22 sectors. Here, the simulator, the tool that you're seeing online is the tool for the digital STRI. And for the digital STRI, we have many more countries. And as you see here in the screen, this is the full view of all the countries. And this has changed since yesterday. So when we recorded the video, we still didn't have the full number of countries. So that's why we were saying that it would be updated soon, but we did it a bit earlier than what we were expecting. So here you already have online the new version of the simulator with all the countries that we've added this year. Janos, do you want to take the floor?
Yes, and thank you for the question. It's really a good one. I will answer it also based on what I wanted to add to Irene's presentation. That what we discussed today looks at the digital STRI, particularly in the interest of time, but the same kind of simulator is available for other STRI sectors, notably computer services, which was also part of the ESCAP exercise, but also other sectors that are relevant for in the context of digital trade. Telecommunications would be one example, retail services, audiovisual services, financial services. And for each of those sectors, there is this detailed breakdown of different kinds of sectoral measures that are relevant to understand what are the regulatory barriers that affect these sectors. And that's maybe also one of the areas where we link in with the Rdtii in terms of having this slightly different approach in terms of the structure that we adopt for looking at barriers to trade. So I think the Rdtii has this pillar structure that looks at different kind of pillars and different kind of measures. In the STRI, we adopted a horizontal approach, which is the digital STRI, and that includes all kinds of measures that apply to any kind of digital activity that that can be undertaken. And then we have a more sectoral approach, sectoral zoom for all the different sectoral measures that are relevant. So it's really a slightly different approach in terms of structure and the way we score the measures, but I think they are quite complementary in terms of the overall objective. So what I really wanted to highlight is that we have all these other simulator tools out there, and if you just Google the STRI website, you're very easily going to find the simulator, the tools, the descriptions that that would be of help for you. And as Irene mentioned, we are working on adding new countries almost every year, and the next ones on our list for January will be Singapore and Vietnam. Thank you, and back to you, Irene, or Vitada, depending on what's next.
Thank you very much, Janos. Yes, so Vitada, the floor is yours.
Sorry, Irene, for crossing. Thank you very much for the explanations, and this exercise is very useful. I believe the participants also feel the same. I just would like to add from what Janos already mentioned about the link between STRI and the Rdtii. If you look at the final results, the two measurements would give the big pictures that reflect the same things, right? Because if it is not the same, then there is a problem. One measure is right, one measure is wrong. But fortunately, we have things in the same direction, so that's good. When it comes into approach, the two measurements took different approach with because they are construct slightly for different purpose. For the STI that you have seen from OECD, the index look very deep into regulatory, the existing laws, mechanisms in each sectors in deep, because they do comprehensive, not only just digital, but also other service as well. And it go deep into computer service. For Rdtii, the main objective of ESCAP is also not just about the database, but to help analysts and policymakers understand the big pictures of what are important to consider when they decide on the digital trade policies. So we try to simplify the complicated regulatory analysis into 11 pillars to highlight the key areas that they want they may need to consider when they make the policies. And we select few indicators under each pillar to reflect the pictures of each policy subdomains here. So from long to short, what I'm trying to say is using the Rdtii approach would allow the building capacity of policy analysts to understand what they need to know in the digital trade policies and then go deep into the decisions in those subdomains. And then for dig deeper into regulations under that subdomains, tools like the STRI or STRI would be very useful for regulators that are level of policymakers and regulators, right? I think Rdtii would maybe more helpful to policymakers who doesn't want to really go into very specific laws and regulations, so they can have big overview understandings of things quickly, and then they use more finer grain indicators in the STRI for regulatory decisions at the lower level of their operations. So I think the two approach are complementing to each others and can be used in slightly different purpose, as well as in giving mirrors of each others as well. So the activities that ESCAP are planning with Rdtii is going to be more towards using both the STI and Rdtii to build capacity for policymakers and policy analysts. Having the database, put it up there like the STI is our secondary objective. It's not our main objective at this stage. With that, actually, Janos, I have a small question related to yesterday. You show us the tools, you call it digital trade integrations, something that's very exciting, that you have RTAs and others tools as well, and you have been able to put it as hard, soft, medium. So I just wonder whether what is, because there are many RTAs that a country is participate, right? How would you be able to come up with one cross-cutting aggregation of this country have soft RTA or hard RTA?
Thank you, Vitala. So for the RTA part of that new tool, we also relied on an external database that was developed by this university in Switzerland, which looked at the different coverage of provisions in RTAs and looked at specifically the extent of binding commitments in the language of these provisions. So for instance, when you have language such as shall do something, that means a more binding commitment, or when you have softer language, which says, for instance, that economies should endeavor to do something or shall do their best to do something, that has maybe a softer level of binding. So this data is out there, and what we did was to integrate it into this tool to provide a more visual way to present actually the level of commitment that economies have undertaken when it comes to e-commerce chapters.
That's very useful. And whether the data behind the tools is available on the OECD platform, or it have to go to a different database.
For the Rdtii specific tool, that is data that we obtained externally.
Okay.
But for the other tool on the instruments, that is data that we collected ourselves. So there we map the different instruments, the provisions in them, and group them in different categories. So that data is available through the OECD resources, and happy to share it with you.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me check in from the participants whether they have any questions. Is there any questions on the OECD, the STI? Please raise your hand, please.
May I ask further from your question about the tool? So the external source is from like Tapet database, right? And is it cover all the areas that cover in the Tapet? Like for example, the data flow in Tapet, they have the data flow under the e-commerce chapter and the data flow outside the e-commerce chapter that cover under the Rdtii. So like wonder the data flow here is from the one that under the e-commerce chapter or the one that outside the chapter.
Thank you, Natisha. Good question. So the focus was particularly on the e-commerce chapters, just to kind of narrow a bit down the overall workload. But it's true that also, like in financial services, you have specific provisions that govern specifically the cross-border data flows that pertain to financial services.
In the chat, I would like you to share with all of you also that ESCAP have data set and policy support tool related to digital trade, focusing on digital trade facilitation and digitalization. Jan has kindly put the link to the data set and the tools there in the chat box. And there is also legal technical trade, digitalization readiness self-assessment tool as well. So please feel free to take a look, and you can reach out to ESCAP team if you need data under those tools. There is a question from Kachindra. Could you please share update link to STI? Definitely. You will see it in the chat. Yep, thanks, Irene, for sharing it. Any other questions? I don't see it now. So thank you very much, Janos and Irene. It's always lovely to have you in the meetings and in our projects collaborations. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Vitada, Jan, and all the ESCAP colleagues. It's really a great pleasure for us to be here, and we really enjoyed this collaboration, so we are looking forward to continuing it.
Sure. We will reach out to you very soon on that.
Thank you.
Okay, next, I would turn to Natisha and Johan. They will help me introduce all of you. Actually, it's not introduced because all of you are supposed to look at the self-reading materials already. But we have the exercise that will force you to go through what within Regional Digital Trade Integration Index. And now we summarize it in few slides before you are going to go through the exercise with us. So Natisha and Johan, please take the floor.
Thank you, Vitada. And Irene and Janos, thank you for the presentation on OECD DSTRI. And Vitada's last comment about the relationship between DSTRI and Rdtii is actually a nice segue to our presentation. First, let me share our screen first. I hope that you can see the screen. Let me know
I
if
can
it does
see.
not didn't show.
I can see your screen. Would you like to put it in presentation mode?
Sure. Great. So our presentation about Regional Digital Trade Integration Index, Rdtii, consists of two parts. In the first section, we're going to provide you with a recap of Rdtii. And we thank you for those of you who have taken time to watch the two pre-session videos and read Rdtii guidelines. In this section, we're going to give you a brief recap of Rdtii, and we will also give you some scoring results, basically what we have found under the framework Rdtii. As Witada mentioned at the beginning of this session, over this year, we invited researchers to gather information about the regulatory measures that apply to digital trade by using Rdtii, and Nanica and I were among the researchers. And I believe that at the end of this year, more vigorous paper about what we have found using Rdtii will be published. And this presentation will provide you with just tip of iceberg of what we have found. And in the second section, we will walk you through the Rdtii exercises and answers. So Rdtii is about informing of regulatory measures that apply to digital trade. Then the first question is, what is digital trade? There are really good definitions, very useful definitions out there. But for the purpose of the Rdtii, we break digital trade down into four basic elements. First, trade in tangible goods through e-commerce. Second, trade in digital content, which is essentially media content such as movies and films and ebooks and things like that. And third element is trade in online services. You can think of fintech, IT services, business services that are delivered online. And last element is cross-border investment in digital trade infrastructure, for example, telecommunication. So I mentioned that Rdtii is about regulatory measures that apply to digital trade. And Rdtii try to capture the openness and harmonization of digital trade regulation. Then the next question would be, why on openness and harmonization of digital trade regulation? The short answer is that because we care about digital economy integration. So on the part of openness, the more open a regulatory environment is, the more competition there will be. And if there is more competition, there will be more innovation in sectors related to digital trade. And this will in turn contribute to digital economy integration in the region at a higher level of development. And on the part of harmonization, harmonization increases interoperability of business in digital trade. This means that because regulation across different economies in the same region are similar or harmonized, businesses feel more at ease to operate their business, to export their products to those economies. And with the increased interoperability, there will be more greater digital economy integration. So then the next question would be, how does Rdtii capture openness and harmonization? So we capture these two concepts by looking at 11 thematic pillars. Witada briefly talked about 11 pillars, and you have probably watched pre-session videos and are aware of this pillar. This pillar, each pillar represents regulatory area, one particular regulatory area. Pillar 1 is about tariff and trade defenses. Pillar 2, public procurement, and so forth. And each pillar consists of several sub-pillars. And sub-pillar represent some sub-area of regulatory area. For example, Pillar 1 consists of tariffs, trade defense, and a membership of WTO Information Technology Agreement. So we gather information about regulation under each sub-pillar and we assign a particular score to each regulatory measure based on some prescribed rules under each subpillar, and we take the score from all the subpillar within a pillar to generate a pillar score, and we take all the pillar score from 11 pillar to generate a final Rdtii score. In Rdtii score, we present a proxy for digital economy integration in terms of openness and harmonization. This means that Rdtii cares only about digital economy integration, and in other words, it does not engage in that subtle balancing of other policy objectives in forming a regulation in a certain field. This means that for some subpillar, this degree of openness and harmonization that would present digital economy integration is actually measured by additional cost that regulation creates. For example, in pillar 1, the higher tariffs are on ICT product, that means that the more additional cost there is in that particular regulatory area, and that existence of additional cost will present the lack of openness, relative lack of openness and harmonization in that pillar. But for other pillars, the consideration of openness and harmonization is more multifaceted. It is measured not just in terms of digital, not just in terms of cost, but also in terms of other policy objective. For example, pillar 7, which is data domestic policy, is measured by not only the cost that data policy create, but also data privacy, data protection, and cybersecurity. So these pillars are meant to inform policymaker to make a more informed decision on complex digital trade policy issues. So with that, I will toss it to Nanisha, who will present on scoring wizard.
Thanks, Johan. So here in this graph, it is the overall Rdtii score by pillars, and this is from the data cover from the 22 Asia Pacific economy that we has conducted research. And first of all, we found that the background of law and policy on the digital trade in the Asia Pacific region is very some economy, for example, Singapore, Australia, and Japan are advanced, and Brunei Darussalam and Vanuatu are at the initial stage of their regulation on the digital to be developed. So this difference on the level of digital regulations could reflect to the diversity in terms of openness toward the digital trade, which could lead to the high cost for the regional trade integrations. And we also found that some economies show no restriction toward the digital trade, and while some of them show the high level of restrictions. And this high level of restriction could increase the cost for the company to engage in digital trade within and outside the regions. And this graph shows that the level of openness and restrictiveness of the 11 Rdtii pillar in the range of 1 and 0. And 0 here refer to the most openness, and 1 refer to the most restrictiveness. And from the graph, it shows that tariff and trade defense measure pillar 1, technical standard pillar 10, and quantitative trade restriction pillar 9. These are the traditional regulatory areas for international trade are the most open areas. And on the other hand, internet intermediary liability and content access, pillar 8, telecommunication infrastructure and competition, pillar 5, and domestic data policy, pillar 7 are the most restrictive pillars. So from here, we can conclude that trade in physical ICT product is more open when compared to trade in online service or digital content. And so this score is contribute from the recent policy changes that will be present you in the next graph. Okay, so in this second graph, it captures the number of economies that have undergone policy change from 2020s. And this graph, and together with the previous graph, it shows that economy tend to put more restriction on new type of digital trade. For example, if you look at the internet intermediaries and content access, the pillar 8. So this is the pillar that are the most restrictive pillars because the economy have imposed the greatest number of restrictions from 2020. And from this, it can be suggest that economy has responded to trade in online service and digital content in a protectionist way. When compared to the tariff and trade defense measure pillar 1 and technical standard pillar 10, these are the pillars that are the most liberal and they are not go like as much changes from 2020. So this can be suggest that the traditional areas for international trade do not require much reformation for the openness of the digital trade. And this area are easily for the economy to achieve the regulatory harmonizations. Over to you, Johan, for the next part.
Thank you. Actually, before we move on, let me know if any questions that pop in your mind regarding the what we just did on the recap of Rdtii. Is there any question on the research or the Rdtii framework? Okay, I can see one hand. Yannis? I think you're on mute, Yannis.
Thank you, rookie mistake. Just one brief question in terms of the integration dimension. So to what extent does the Rdtii take into account preferential regional measures as opposed to what applies elsewhere? Because I'm curious a little bit about the difference between measuring the level of restrictiveness and measuring the level of integration. And to me, the level of integration would necessarily mean also, for instance, when we talk about tariffs, usually there is a more preferential tariffs for certain trade partners, for instance, in the APEC region or ASEAN region, as opposed to countries elsewhere. So does the Rdtii take that integration dimension into account when, for instance, different kinds of rules apply to different trade partners? Thank you.
Thank you, Yannis, for the question. So, Rdtii is also measured the harmonization or integration, as you mentioned. And one of the way to measure the harmonization is to take into account some international legal framework or regional legal frameworks. As I mentioned about the Pillar 1, Pillar 1 considered WTO Information Technology Agreement, but that is not necessarily actually regional agreement. It is plurilateral agreement that where the members are some of the WTO members. So I guess we can strictly say that it is strictly about like regional integration in digital trade. And there are several international legal framework we take into account in throughout the pillars. So that is one of the way that we try to measure the harmonization that goes beyond the Asia Pacific region. But in particularly regional integration, we sometimes, some of the pillars take into account some regional initiative or regional legal framework. For example, Pillar 7, Pillar 6 considers APEC CBPR, which is a regional framework for cross-border data policies. And of course, APEC members are not necessarily all the Asia Pacific economies. So there is a little gap between the membership of the APEC and the Asia Pacific economy. But that is one of the way we try to measure the regional integration, although not in a perfect way. But the regular, even though we may not have like perfectly narrowly tailored to regional integration, some of the regulatory measure and some of the pillars actually take into account the harmonization. Pillar 10 and Pillar 11. Pillar 10 is about technical standards. So the main concern about under that pillar is actually to increase the interoperability of technical standards, like the technical standards that apply to ICT products some of the encryption standards, whether certain encryption standards that is required by an economy is aligned with internationally recognized encryption standards, and we also consider whether the customs at various economies accept third-party lab research for electronic goods or electronic magnetic goods and things like that. So what I'm trying to say is that the domestic regulatory measures, some of them are geared towards regional integration in that way. You might even say that we kind of set aside some specific certain pillars or certain sub-pillars for harmonization, and other pillars are more geared towards the openness. I hope that answered your question, Dennis.
Yes, thank you very much. That's much clearer now. Thank you.
Let me add small things from what Johan already said. Yes, we do try to have regional dimensions into the Rdtii approach whenever possible. For example, when it's come to tariff, what you have seen in tariff pillars is actually the effective rate of tariff, which means is the tariff including preferential trade tariff applied to the groups of concerns. Here, the group that we concern is Asia Pacific, but when researchers learn the approach and would like to apply the analysis in their interested group, they could change the group that used as a benchmark to some other groups and then calculate effective tariff rate for that particular group. So definitely, especially Pillar 1, there is regional dimensions, regional integrations in that dimensions. Some pillars is simply doesn't have indicators for regional approach, not because we don't have regional benchmark, but because the benchmark that the region takes is the global one. So then the regional dimension is merged into the bigger group, which is the global standards. But our principles, when we add indicators into each pillars, we try to refer back to whether we can have regional benchmark or not. And then that's why Johan mentions APEC CBPR, which for now it is the biggest regional group that we can find until we have another bigger regional wide benchmark than APEC CBPR that can be replaced. So Rdtii is the framework for analysis, and each indicators will be reviewed and changed as per newer data and better information available.
Thank you, Vitala. That's really, really helpful. Thank you very much for that clear answer.
Thanks. Okay. Johan, please.
Thank you. Is there any other question among the participants? Okay, we will move on to the next section, and just let me know if you have any question that you want to ask. So in this section, we're going to walk you through the Rdtii exercises questions that have been already shared with you through MS Form. And we thank you for those of you who have taken your time to take a look at them and submit your answers. So the purpose of this exercise is to give you a little taste of what Rdtii is like and what scoring under the framework Rdtii is like. So the questions are actually about some legal question, meaning that some question ask about a certain like legal mechanism and how that legal mechanism works, and other questions about policy question, meaning that it asks why does that law exist? Why it is helpful for digital economy integration, and why it is one is more restrictive than the other. So, as I think as Ritada mentioned at the before this presentation, the purpose of the Rdtii is to provide capacity building for policy analysis or policymakers, and we think that the understanding what laws are out there and why they are necessary is very important for policy analysis, and that is why we sort of laid out various questions through this opportunity. So without further ado, we'll go into the question one. The question one is about Pillar 1, tariffs and trade defense. So Pillar 1 consists of many sub-pillars, and one of the sub-pillars is ITA. As I mentioned, it requires companies to eliminate duties on ICT products. And another sub-pillar under Pillar 1 is the coverage ratio of zero tariff lines in ICT products. It basically means that how many products do not have tariffs in a given economy. So the question asks, why Pillar 1 include the two sub-pillars? Because they look similar. Because ITA is about eliminating import duties, and coverage ratio is basically a factual inquiry. How many zero tariff lines there are. So isn't it overlap? Isn't it double scoring? So most of you, I mean, actually all of you gave us a correct answer. The answer is being a signatory to WTO ITA means that economy is bound to eliminate import duties on the ICT products. That means that there will be more predictability and more certainty. You can think of an economy that is not a member of ITA, but does not impose tariffs on ICT products. But then that economy can start impose tariffs on ICT product. That means that there is less certainty and predictability how the regulating economy will go about regulating ICT products at customs. So this is the answer. And through this exercise, we actually wanted to illustrate, which I already mentioned in answering Jan's question, that Rdtii incorporate some international legal framework. And as Ritada mentioned, in the absence of a regional framework, we try to find international legal framework. But if there is a regional framework, we try to use that for the sake of regional integration. That is one of the common themes that run through the Rdtii. And Rdtii also cares about certainty and predictability. Investors want to know what's going on in the regulating economy before they invest and sell their products to that economy. So there is the other common theme that is illustrated through the exercise. Anyone have any question on this particular question? Okay, we can move on. You can always interrupt me and raise question that pops up your mind. I will sporadically just stop to just make sure that if you guys have any question. Then moving on to exercise 2, which is about public procurement. So the question asks, the following measures are restrictions on source code, encryption, and trade secrets. And the question further asks, categorize the following measures into 2 groups. Which of the groups has the greater potential to restrict digital trade? So the restriction on source code and encryption trade secret, one of the sub-pillar of this Pillar 2, and this one was actually a little difficult, a little tricky. The answer is that the 2 groups are, first, a requirement to submit source codes, and the other group is a requirement to use a specific encryption standard. So which one is more restrictive? So Rdtii considers the first group as more restricted than the second group because it basically requires business to turn their trade secrets to the government to win public procurement bidding. And often trade secret which is one of the intellectual property, is core asset or very important asset of businesses, and it could be really crucial asset for SMEs. So it is very difficult for them to just give in the source code or trade secret to the government for winning the procurement project. So it is considered trade blocking. On the other hand, requirement to use a specific interest standard is not as restrictive the first group because the business do not need to turn over their trade secret, but that does not mean it is not restrictive. The specific encryption standard could not be aligned with international encryption standard. That means that businesses have to incorporate that particular standard into their production, into their products or services, and that means increased cost. It undermines interoperability. So that is why it is trade discouraging. So this exercise, we wanted to show that there is varying degree of openness under the framework of Rdtii. So at the beginning, I mentioned that one of the wings, one of the prongs of the digital integration is openness, but there is varying degree of openness. One, the restrictive trade regulatory measures, not equally restrictive. One trade regulatory measure is more restricted than the another. So in our example, the requirement to submit source code is actually trade blocking, more restrictive than the other group, which is trade discouraging. It discourages foreign businesses from participating in your trade. So that is one of the common theme that applies throughout the Rdtii framework. So this one has actually a very difficult question. There's a little tricky. There's a little tricky question. Tricky answer choices. Those of you who taken your time to answer this, any questions you want to raise? Okay, we can move on. And the exercise 3 is about foreign direct investment, and it asks about joint venture requirement. And this one actually, everyone who answered submit answer got this one right. Explain why it is restricted to require a foreign firm to form a joint venture with a domestic firm. So the answer is, forming a joint venture requirement may not be the best solution for every individual circumstances. Surely, joint venture requirement can be effective strategy, right? Because foreign firm may not know what's going on in their investing economy, so they may need a domestic partner who can help them to navigate through the webs of regulations and laws. But it does not necessarily true for every situation. It is actually should be up to businesses rather than the government who should determine that question for business strategy. And that is the first reason. And another reason is that there is a concern that technology might be forcefully transferred. So, as I mentioned, intellectual property rights are core assets, and there is an inherent hesitation to share core assets with domestic partners. Surely, partner can adopt some legal mechanisms such as non-disclosure requirement, but as I mentioned, there is some kind of unwillingness, some inherent, hesitation not to share their trade secrets. So that is another reason why it is restricted. And throughout the Rdtii, the Rdtii sometimes consider that the government is not the best decision maker. So in this example, I already illustrated how is that so. But in Pillar 8 and Pillar 7, which deals with data domestic policies, sometimes it should be up to the discretion of business owners, not necessarily government. There are some policy objectives that the governments care about, but for the sake of digital economy integration, some things should be left to the discretion of business owners, and this will be dealt with more in later question. Most of you, I mean, all of you got this one right. So the next question is about intellectual property right. It asks the most common two copyright exceptions are doctrine of fair use and doctrine of fair dealing. Which one is more favorable to foreign businesses venturing into domestic market? And all of you actually got this one right. Doctrine of fair use is more, conducive to foreign, international digital trade, because it is more flexible concept. Doctrine of fair use lays out factors and evaluate certain use of copyrighted material, already copyrighted material, based on several factors in order to find out whether that use does not need to get author's consent or author's permission. And there is always room for arguing, for foreign business to argue that my use is fair under these circumstances. Whereas the doctrine of fair dealing is quite a strict concept. It it lists out every permissible uses out there. If particular use does not conform to this list, then it is not fair and it is not lawful. So there is less wiggle room for foreign business to argue that its use is fair. So this one shows that Rdtii sometimes go through very narrow policy choice. Earlier, I mentioned that Rdtii cares about predictability, certainty, and surely one may argue that the doctrine of fair dealing is more predictable and certain because it gives out the least. But in this case, we chose the scope of protection rather than predictability and certainty, because the doctrine of fair use has a narrower scope of protection. Because it basically exists all the possible uses that can be obtained without author's consent. So it has a narrower scope of protection, whereas in the doctrine of fair use, although it is a little case by case, like factual inquiry, it provides room for them to argue that my use is fair. So it has broader scope of protection. So you can see that there is some narrow policy choice, and in this particular example, we went for the broader scope of protection in favor of foreign businesses. And next exercise is about telecom infrastructure and competition. Well, I think I can see the question on the chat box.
We can come back to the questions in the chat box later. Yeah. Sure.
So telecommunication infrastructure asks you to define liberalization, because one of the sub-pillar asks whether a telecom market in a given economy has been liberalized. And our liberalization is a somewhat amorphous concept. It is not, a little gray concept. So the Rdtii tries to lay out different factors in order to best measure this liberalization, and there are three factors. The first one is the extent to which the telecom facility sector has been regulated under competition rules. Secondly, the extent to which an access network are owned by dominant players in the market. And the last factor is the extent to which foreign ownership is allowed it. So this example, we wanted to show that Rdtii is mindful of lack of transparency. Often telecom market is not transparent. It is not like accurately captured by what law says, what regulations says necessarily. It sometimes depends on market circumstances and how those laws and regulations actually apply in reality. So we noticed that that is one of the characteristics of telecom regulation. So we try to capture the circumstances of the market in order to measure the liberalization, and Rdtii in other pillars as well, in public procurement and technical standards, try to be mindful of lack of transparency. So So just wanted to show that this is how the Rdtii deals with lack of transparency. The answer is by looking at the circumstances, by looking at the reality. So the next question is about cross-border data policies. The question asks, so first pillar deals with local storage processing infrastructure. Categorize the following measure into one of these three conditions, and this was quite easy. Everyone got this one right. The first two examples, local storage. The next two examples are local processing, and the last one, local infrastructure. If you think about it, the answer choices are actually a little bit self-evident. For example, Turkey requires system operator and so forth to collect all relevant document records within the country. So it is about local storage. It requires business to retain a copy of data before they transfer data abroad. So it is a condition. So local processing is actually more restricted than local storage because it not only requires them to store, but also process locally before they transfer. And infrastructure is most restricted because it requires them to establish a data center. So you can see the spectrum of the restrictiveness, and you can see how one is more restrictive than another. So that's about it for up to pillar 6. Do any of you have any questions so far?
Johan, let me bring attention to question in the chat.
Sure.
First questions that we may need to address is, actually it's not just about Rdtii though, because I believe that the same question would be also applied when considering the STI as well. So Janos and Irene, if you have some chip in, you can also say. The question is whether the score always reflect higher costs or not, or it is just the measure of restrictions on regulations, which maybe it could have not always negative impacts.
So I think generally most of the pillars measure openness in terms of additional cost, but that is often found in some traditional areas of regulation, such as tariffs and public procurement and foreign direct investment, and as well as the technical standard, which is non-trade measures. So I think generally, yes, it is measured by additional cost, but it is not necessarily true for all the pillars. For example, data policies, it is measured by additional cost that data creates, but also it also considered data privacy and data protection, how well certain data policy captures data privacy and data protection, because data privacy and data protection contribute to digital trust. And without digital trust, consumers or clients are very hesitant to allow their allow the firms that they hire to transfer their data abroad. So it is very important that there is strong data privacy mechanism and data protection mechanism. And it is one of the parameters that go into the consideration of openness. But often the question becomes the relation between the objective and the means, meaning that our objective is digital economy integration. And the question is how particular data mechanism promotes and how tight it is the relation between, for example, here the local storage requirement and our ultimate aim, which is digital economy integration or lower cost and more harmonization. And I think it is a very difficult question. And I believe that it may require some empirical data, but in terms of policy, in terms of the value that data policy or a certain regulation creates, I think we can conceptually argue one way or another. And The way we argue under the data policies is that data privacy and data protection is actually good for openness. So I think it is a very difficult question, but generally, yes, it is measured by additional cost.
Yep, let me also add to this question. I think that there are assumptions behind all these measurements that regulations in general add cost to business, but it's not the linear function. So there is certain level of regulations that you need to make things in order, but beyond that, it is too much. So as Johan mentioned, general direction is yes, is more costly, but for particular areas, it has to be balanced with the trust and the openness between operators across countries. But I would like to also bring attention to additional perspective, which is after we calculate these all measurements, right? One more step we should be doing is comparing how large is the distance between the regulations among members in the groups. Yesterday, OECD used the term of regulatory distance. In Rdtii, we would have the indicators of regulatory similarity. So it's kind of pretty much the same concepts that try to measure how harmonized of these groups in terms of regulations, and that should be used in empirical analysis more than just the regulation, the restrictiveness index alone. Yoon, I hope this clarifies. And Yoon has another question.
Thank you. Thank you.
Kumitala, sorry, can I just add to your question, or add to Kon Young's question? So whether higher regulation brings more or less investment, I think it's a slightly different question on whether it increases costs on business, right? Because it might be the case that doing business is still more expensive. It's just that you can attract more businesses for having, because businesses don't only they don't only care about direct costs of products, they also care about how much they can develop their business in a particular location. So I think it's important to make a difference between the cost of something and the actual business value of that same regulation, just to add that.
Yes.
And if I can, sorry, if I can just add just one more twist to this question, is for example, you can have it on paper, a regulation can be on paper, but again, there's the implementation part. And since we're talking about a very diverse countries, they may be holding the similar kind of blueprints, but in terms of the implementation can be very different. So from the business point of view, some businesses where the implementation is more laxed will not suffer the cost, while like in Singapore, for example, where for example regulations may be strongly enforced, then the costs will be high. So I'm saying sometimes what you're capturing may be on paper, but does it reflect what is happening on the ground? That's my question. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
That's one element that Rdtii try to looking into it. We have the indicators that not really reflects the existence of the law, but how the country implement the laws. For example, based on business surveys or complaints from parties that make. But this kind of indicators, it is very controversial. We have also received comments from the countries And also from our own analysis, we also concerns that whether there is bias in reporting these complaints or not, whether there is political economies reflect in this type of indicators. So we try to address that, but with very caution. Johan, would you like to add anything?
I think I agree with you, Ritada. Nanisha, can you do you have anything to add on that question?
So like we try to maybe like in the future develop to take only the what is can be found in the law, because we like try to make the Rdtii to be more like transparent. Just that.
Yes, just to add to that a little bit. Although as I presented, Pillar 5 try to look at the reality, it is still a challenge for Rdtii to capture how the laws or regulation apply actually. And I think that is the inherent challenge for many research databases that try to capture regulation across many nations. And we try to minimize that problem by helping researchers to further go deeper into hierarchy of laws and regulations. Sometimes looking at legislative law may not be enough, because it just spells out some sort of intelligible principle for an administrative agency with expertise to follow, and then administrative agencies then spell out more in detail what they should regulate a certain matter. So, by doing this, we try to minimize this problem, and also we do try to address the transparency in the way that I presented about Pillar 5. But that's how I think is the inherent challenge for our research tool.
And also I add a bit. So we use like the secondary resource as the guideline for the researcher to look at the legislation of certain country as we use the complaint as a supplementary, but we try when to list the source, we try to use the exact regulations by, as Johan said, that looking to the hierarchy of the law by looking at the notification, official measures, that not just the act. Yes.
I can see hands up from Irene.
Yes, thank you very much. I just wanted to point out that this is a very important challenge that we also faced in the STRI and the digital STRI. The approach we adopted in the STRI is to keep it to what our colleague was mentioning, what the law in paper. In the sense, we're not looking only at the law, we're looking at all levels of the regulatory environment. However, we stick to what is prescribed in the legal text, because we consider that getting into the reports, it might introduce too much bias. And specifically, what we consider that it is important for companies is the previsibility. So it is important that what the text is there, it is applied. So even if the fact that not applying a text would reduce the cost, for us, this is not possible to predict for a company. So this unpredictability includes a gap in transparency that for us would also become a restriction. However, for the approach in the STRI is really to look at the text in all the levels of the regulation. So not only law, also administrative decrees or government decisions. However, really to stay in that text and not go into the reports that I know, as you were explaining in the Rdtii, it is included.
Thank you, Irene. I also see hands up from Irene.
Yeah, hi. Maybe I should have asked this earlier in your presentation with regards to the index measuring harmonization and then openness. Is there does it penalize one side of the either how do you say it? Either dimension? Because if you have maybe the laws are harmonizing, but you have harmonized restrictive laws.
Yes, thank you for your question. That's really good question. Maybe Nanisha, can you take that or?
Yeah, okay. So this I will answer from the data that we have found. So we can find that there are like 4 types of country in general, which are the country that have the law, but the law is kind of the restrictive, and the country that do not have the law, and the country that have the law and in terms of openness. So the group of country that have the law in the similar way, but they are restrictive, that they are in the same group. Is it like clear out for your answer? For your question?
When ESCAP calculate regional regulatory similarities, we take into account the openness as well as the similarities of the country. So what we will reflect in the indicators would range between -1 to 1. So minus would be very similar but not open.
Okay, thank
one
you.
will be, yeah.
Thank you for clarifying.
Yep, I also see questions in the chat. Yong Yoon asked whether our indicators, for example, IP or standards, are they overlapped with what generally called non-tariff measures in other databases like Unctad trades? Because in Unctad, they also have the database documenting IP, technical standards, so on and so forth, and whether that's the same as what we use in the indicators or not.
So for the IP here, we cover only the patent and the copyright, but in the Unctad, it's cover more type of the intellectual property. But if you ask for the patent and copyright, yes, it is overlap.
Yeah. Here, Yong Yoon, the focus is on digital sectors. So any measures that we capture, when possible, it's directly linked to digital goods, digital service. That's why only patent and copyright are selected into our indicators, not general IP.
Okay, so but there is certainly an overlap. I think from what I hear,
there is some overlap.
One could be a subset of the other one, right?
NTMs in Unctad is more focused on goods.
Yes.
So that will be not much relevant when it's come to digital service.
Okay, not much. Okay, thank you for the response.
Question from Lawrence. He wants to have explanations on what is last mile.
Sure. So the last mile is one of the telecom lags in the telecom networks, and so the last mile is the part where that connects telecom service providers and end users. So if we look at the exercise 5, the second factor is about access network or the last mile. The last mile, we call it last mile because it is the last part of the telecom network that go to the end users. And the reason why we care about this is because it is the very part that allows telecom service providers to provide their services to end users. If it is dominantly owned by some dominant players in the market, that means that there is less room for competition. So we try to capture that by using this vector. I think for now we can move on to the next question.
Yes.
Danica, can you
exercise?
start from?
Sure. So I will start on exercise 7 on domestic data policy. So this question asks about the data retention requirement, which is a requirement that the government require the company to retain some data for a certain period of time or certain purpose. So this question asks which one of the following data retention requirement do you think deserve a higher score or more restrictive? So the answer here is the first choice, Australia, because the country require the telecommunication data to be captured for 2 years. So this fixed period is considered this as the minimum data retention requirement. And in the second choice, Korea require data controller to destroy the personal data once the purposing has been done. So this type of data retention requirement, we consider it as the maximum period of data retention because it doesn't prescribe the time period and it deals on the purpose of the usage of certain data. So the answer here is the first choice, which is more restrictive because we consider that the minimum period of data retention is more restrictive than the maximum because the maximum usually the companies still allowed to determine themselves how long they will keep the data, and usually as we found, the minimum period of data retention requirement usually can be go up to more than 10 years, which is costly for the small business and increase the cost for the company as they are required to retain the data for a certain period of time. And next, please. And the common theme of this question is that the government may not be the best decision maker to provide certain requirements to the companies because the company indeed they know themselves whether they should perform certain activities or not because they are the one who bear the cost. And this requirement is similar to the one that Johan mentioned previously about the requirement to perform the joint venture with the local partner. Also, it's same as the requirement for the company to perform the data protection impact assessment or appoint a data protection officer, because whether to do this activity or not, it should allow the company to decide by themselves. Okay, so next question. So this question is focused on the Pillar 8 on intermediary liability and content access. So this question asks about the safe harbor provisions and asks you to explain why the lack of safe harbor is considered restricted to digital trade. So the answer here is that the lack of safe harbor will be discourage the trade, and the lack of it can be restrictive because the internet intermediaries are not the most efficient cost barriers. They should not be liable for the illegal content that posted by the user or the copyright infringement content that they are not the one who post it, and the user should be liable for their certain actions. And the another part is that the lack of safe harbor will be discourage the trade because of the less of certainty and less of chilling effect from potential litigations. And this also eventually will limit the innovation service that internet intermediary may be perform of. And this type of question, the common theme is that it is similar to when the lack of the measure is considered restrictive. This is same as when the Pillar 7, when they do not have the country doesn't have the comprehensive data protection requirement. So without this legal rule, the business may be uncertain, like because the existence of the data protection legal framework provide them the data protection and ensure the privacy. Also, this is similar to when the country is a signatory to the international framework, because it will create the harmonization. So I will skip to the next question. And this question is about the Pillar 9 on quantitative trade restrictions, and it deals with the ban on ICT product and online service. And this question try to make you more familiar with the structure of the Rdtii by let you try to find the example of the import ban imposed by economy on ICT product. So we got several questions from all of you, and here is the question that we picked, which is the few Arab states have banned on voice over internet protocol, which prohibit the use of audio and video calls using WhatsApp or FaceTime. And the United States banned on Huawei product. And also the ban we consider to be the most restrictive when compared to other quantitative trade restriction, because it completely prohibit the flow of trade in goods. Also, usually the country impose this ban for protect the national security or cyber security within the domestic market as well. And I will go to the next questions. So this question on question 10 is on technical standard applied to ICT good and online service. And this question asks about the additional screening or testing requirement on ICT products. So which of the following is the least restrictive toward the digital trade? And all of the choice here is the screening and testing requirement. And the answer is number 4, or Thailand, because the countries has imposed the additional testing requirement on telecommunication equipment to be tested, but the country still recognize the foreign testing result, which can be lower the cost and may help to accelerate the process of the good import into the countries. But if you look at choice number 1 and 2 and 3, the country does not do not accept the third-party testing result. So here again, the answer is number 4. And the common theme for this type of question is the regulatory harmonization, which has mentioned earlier that it will can be held to decrease the cost of doing business, and the type of the requirement that's similar to this. Also the requirement on the sales certification that the country have to ensure that the electronic product is conform with the safety requirement. And okay, I will go to the last question. So this last question is focused on the Pillar 11 on online sale and transaction, which is the measure related to the e-commerce. And here, so which do you think is the most restrictive toward trade in e-commerce for the online purchase, delivery, and advertisement? So the answer here is all of them, because the first choice, Philippines ban on foreign ownership. This completely prohibit the foreign business. And in the second choice, India provided B2B e-commerce must not have more than one vendor that account for more than 75% of sale. So this question, it will be trade blocking if the foreign have sourced one vendor from the foreign business have sourced one vendor in certain countries. And the third question on Pakistan, it prohibits the advertisement from Indians. So this one is the ban on the advertisement, which is the service associated to the e-commerce. And the common theme of this is trade blocking measures. So if you have any questions, please let me know.
I don't see questions.
Mhm.
Yep. Thank you very much, Nanisha and Johan. I think this is very clear, and I think we probably come to the last part of the workshops already, which I would like to thank all speakers of today, Janos, Irene, Johan, Nanisha, and all the participants. I also would like to thank Wanarat, who has take very important role in putting everything together and connect speakers and the participants. So thank you very much, Khun Nok Wanarat here. For all of you who participate in these workshops, we are still given 1 more week for you to complete the exercise. So by you please submit the exercise to us. Wanarat, could you remind me what is the last day?
Monday 20th.
Okay, by Monday, all the exercise and the evaluation feedbacks, please send to us. Wanarat would give all the details in the chat, and we will email you the certificates after we got all those homework from you. Yes, so last chance, if you would like to ask any questions to our speakers, resource persons today. I see none. So then that's all for these workshops, and please feel free to contact us if you have follow-up questions. I will be happy to pass it on to all the speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.
Thank
See
you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.